Hello, I'm Michael Brown, President of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our third Creative Thought Forum event, which is part of our 2022 series, Seeking Justice Toward a More Equitable America. The series explores issues of social justice from multiple perspectives. Future webinars in the series will consider environmental justice, the future of monuments and public memorialization, and what some see as the decline of truth standards in public discourse in the United States. We're grateful to the following Creative Thought Forum sponsors for their support of this event and the whole series. First, the National Endowment for the Humanities. They ask us to say that opinions and proposals expressed in this event are not necessarily those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'd also like to acknowledge Patricia Foshi for the Stewart Hall Charitable Fund, the Pelohema Foundation, Thornburg Investment Management, the Luke and Betty Vortman Endowment Fund, the Flora Crichton Lecture Fund, and members of SAR's Founder Society. Events like these are made possible through the generous support of our donors and members. If you'd like to have information on how to become an SAR member, please visit our website at members.sarsf.org. We also welcome donations for this event in particular. Now, on to our participants, our speakers, I should say, a real dream team of experts in intellectual property and native rights. First, Trevor Reed, who's Associate Professor of Law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. Trevor holds a JD and a PhD from Columbia University as an expert on intellectual property law and its impact on Native American communities. Dr. Reed is currently advancing community partnered projects to assist Indigenous peoples as they protect and promote their cultural heritage, their traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions. He works closely with the Hopi tribe in whose communities he spent much of his childhood. Madhavi Sunder is the Frank Sherry Professor of Intellectual Property and also Associate Dean for International and Graduate Programs at Georgetown University School of Law. She received her BA from Harvard and a JD degree from Stanford. She's noted for expertise in all areas of intellectual property law and technology law, including copyright, patents, and trademark. You may have seen her recently in various media as she made the case for waiving the pharmaceutical patents for COVID-19 vaccines in the interest of making vaccines more readily available to the developing world. Our third presenter is Jane Anderson. She's Associate Professor of Anthropology and Museum Studies and a Global Fellow in the Engelberg Center for Innovation and Law and Policy at the Law School of NYU, New York University. She received a doctorate in law from the University of New South Wales in Australia. Her work is focused on the philosophical and practical problems for intellectual property law and the protection of Indigenous and traditional knowledge, resources, and cultural heritage. She's co-founder of the innovative website Local Context, that's localcontext.org, about which we'll be hearing more later, which offers creative ways to help Indigenous communities manage their intellectual and cultural property, their environmental data, and their genetic heritage. So, I'll ask our three presenters to join me here. Nice to see everybody. Trevor, let's start with you, and if you wouldn't mind, it would be very helpful, I think, just to talk in a general sense about what cultural appropriation is or what the problem is, because a lot of people don't really understand why borrowing Indigenous ideas, concepts, aspects of performance, stories, can be harmful or in some cases deeply hurtful to Native communities. Could you just give us a quick sort of summary of that issue?
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. The term cultural appropriation, I think, has bounced around in a variety of different ways. I mean, some people have called it cultural misappropriation, to clarify that we're concerned about the taking of things that might be inappropriate or against the law. But I think what we're talking about here really is cultural abuse, using culture in a way that harms people physically, emotionally, psychologically, intellectually. It harms their sovereignty, their economic well-being. And I think it also harms their ability to create going forward. If I could just have the slides, my first slide there. So last year, many of us woke up to this disturbing New York Times headline. Andrea Smith, a longtime scholar activist and leading figure of Native American studies, was in fact not Cherokee. Genealogical research that had been done showed definitively that she had no Indigenous ancestry at all and had apparently been lying about her identity for years. She had for years collected paychecks and honoraria under claims of Indigenous ancestry. And in fact, her words moved me personally and inspired me. And in fact, they still do, and really motivated a generation of young scholars. And it seemed that these were coming from a place of sincerity. And yet Smith's identity and those of many other academics, artists, and entrepreneurs like her was in fact a fabrication. An identity not based on inheritance, but on unauthorized appropriation. Go ahead and next slide. To put a definition on it, I guess I'll borrow from this statement in Bruce Ziff and Pratima Rao's book, Borrowed Power. Cultural appropriation generally involves some sort of transfer or use of something socially valuable from those who, at least from a particular point of view, shouldn't be entitled to it. And this might be the means, maybe taking a means of identification, maybe taking creative or cultural expression, know-how, inventions or medicine, or any other aspect of culture without going through the necessary process, getting the necessary permissions or establishing the necessary standards, going through established standards of care. Now, to be clear, I think appropriation of culture that surrounds us is really something we do naturally all the time. I think Rosemary Coombe, many of us have pointed out that we all appropriate the culture that surrounds us just to survive, just to function in society. Really, the very possibility of human communication requires some sort of appropriation of culture. But I think while cultural appropriation is necessary for individuals to really develop and flourish as individuals, the unauthorized taking of Indigenous culture really is something more, especially in the context of settler colonialism. A couple of my colleagues, Angela R. Riley, Kristen Carpenter, Rebecca Sosi, and my colleagues here on this call have shown that appropriations of Indigenous culture have really occurred hand in hand with periods of genocide, including military conquest, dispossession, assimilation, cultural and political marginalization. Really, unauthorized taking of Indigenous culture compounds these kinds of psychological and social and political wounds that Indigenous peoples have experienced. Let's go ahead and move on to the next. So to get into how these harms work, let me go in depth into one example of appropriation I've been working with in recent years. This woman, Laura Bolton, traveled to my homeland in 1940 to record some of our most sacred ceremonial songs. Even before she stepped foot on our tribal lands, she had signed a deal with Victor Records, one of the major labels of the day, to release an album. And once she was at Hopi, she made around 120 recordings and then traveled on throughout the Southwest, making hundreds more. Actually, over the course of her career, she made something like 30,000 recordings of Indigenous and local peoples' creativity and culture. In 1941, she released an album, Indian Music of the Southwest, and it sold several hundred copies, and then she re-released it through Smithsonian Folkways and sold over 5,000 copies, at least through 1986. We don't know how many more after 1986, but you can still hear it on Spotify. You can certainly download it on iTunes and other outlets. She never, even though she was somebody who was very meticulous with her copyright rights personally, she never made any sort of agreements with the Indigenous people she recorded. Ultimately, she sold her entire collection to Columbia University in a deal that was roughly between $1.3 and $2.5 million in today's dollars. Of course, none of the tribal members ever saw any of those dollars. Now, neither the tribe nor tribal members knew anything about these recordings. So when I checked in with them about 75 years later, and this is kind of where we're at. What do we do about a situation like this? Well, in 2003, Columbia University Center for Ethnomusicology, led at the time by Aaron Fox, decided to take responsibility in its complicity with these kinds of misappropriations and abuses of Indigenous culture, and sent me and a number of other student scholars out to communities to understand how Columbia University could make this situation better, and how to make communities whole again. What we found was that communities had experienced a number of different kinds of harms. Some identified shame and embarrassment due to disclosure of their ceremonies to groups like the Boy Scouts or fraternal organizations, record labels, or publishers. Others talked about bad public policy that had come about because of unauthorized depictions of Hopi life. Several people pointed out that our communities are now closed to outsiders in some cases out of fear of misappropriation, which really intrudes on the way that our ceremonies should work. And some have talked about how children have been confused about the right source of knowledge within our community. Now, in restitution, some people have talked about monetary damages. Others have talked about requiring implementation of Hopi law going forward and standards of care in future uses of these recordings. And other people have talked about responsible return of these recordings to Hopi people. Let me grab the next slide. Now, Hopi has, of course, experienced many harms from cultural abuse, as have many other Indigenous communities. And so I'll point out just a few of these. Publications or entertainment venues that use Hopi people or Hopi beings as the subject of entertainment to sell their goods and services, certainly in violation of Hopi law and standards of care. I mentioned earlier fraternal organizations that have appropriated ceremonies, auction houses and art dealers around the globe that are selling Hopi culture and ritual items without permission, though many foundations and individual activists have stepped in to repurchase those. Bioprospectors have attempted to sell our seeds and agricultural processes without getting permission. Others have attempted to genetically alter these materials, and some have reintroduced these kinds of materials back into our agricultural community. And others have appropriated things like architecture, design, and other kinds of art forms. So abuses of these kinds certainly convert our culture into commodities and actively compete with our own creators. But I think more importantly, the process of commodification outside of these established protocols and standards that we uphold is really degrading. It harms our dignity, and it certainly harms our ability to care for these things and the responsibilities and duties that we have. Further, these kinds of appropriations actually could be dangerous to the appropriators. Certain kinds of effects will come about because people have decided to appropriate things and use them against well-established laws, well-established standards of care. And finally, by sidelining our existing laws governing these kinds of culture, settler populations are effectively invading our political sphere, intruding on our cultural sovereignty, and certainly violating the widely recognized principles in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, I'll just say at the outset, and this is just to continue the conversation on this last slide, that Indigenous peoples also are active creators of culture. So let's go ahead and bring up that last slide, please. Indigenous peoples are certainly active creators of culture and need the ability to appropriate from prior generations in positive ways. And so whatever legal solutions we do come up with need to also allow Indigenous peoples the freedom to take from the past and be able to utilize it in free and open ways to develop law in this space, allow Indigenous communities to shape their own public sphere going forward. So this is kind of a tough call, a catch-22, where certainly we want to prevent harmful cultural appropriations from happening, but we certainly need to enable Indigenous communities to thrive and develop their own legal structures and ways to safeguard culture going forward, while also incentivizing creativity. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Michael, again, for the invitation to chat.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for this invitation. It's great to be here. Your work, of course, inspired me tremendously, at the turn of the century, and I keep writing in this area. I hope I'm evolving myself as I do so. And then it's great, of course, to be on this panel with Trevor and Jane. So looking forward to the overall conversation. So Michael asked me to first lay out in some broad strokes why, in some contexts at least, traditional intellectual property, I'm a professor, as Michael said, of intellectual property law, and so why is it that intellectual property has not in many ways been a viable tool for protecting Indigenous creation? In particular, that has been the case with respect to so-called traditional knowledge. And I'm definitely going to touch on that. But then I'm also going to argue that IP nonetheless can play a useful role as a solution, in fact, to the appropriation of Indigenous creation in some contexts. And that is because Indigenous creation is category much broader than traditional knowledge, as I think Trevor started to talk about at the end of his remarks. Indigenous people are contemporary creators, artists, scientists, who should be recognized and remunerated for that work, and rightly so under traditional intellectual property tools such as trademark and copyright, as just some examples. That said, my current work is looking at the many ways in which this body of work of intellectual property doctrine and theory really needs to contend with the myriad problems beyond just the TK problem or the traditional knowledge problem, in which racial capitalism impedes the ability of Indigenous and other creators of color to be legally recognized and rewarded for their knowledge production. So in fact, I contend that intellectual property has a cultural appropriation problem. From music to fashion to dance to video games, intellectual property today is beset by claims of creators of culture that their expressive works are being pillaged to the credit and profit of others with more power and wealth. From Black creators on TikTok to Indigenous artists whose designs are appropriated by multinational fashion companies, we hear cultural appropriation as a phrase on everyone's lips. I want to just touch on my own definition of cultural appropriation. I think the one that Trevor offered is a bit broader than the one I'm adopting. I don't define cultural appropriation simply as the taking of knowledge from a culture that's not one's own. I think that approach is too broad. Culture itself necessarily involves sharing and borrowing, inspiration, mixing, ripping, and burning. But I do adopt cultural critic Ejima Oluo's definition of cultural appropriation as, quote, the adoption or exploitation of another culture by a more dominant culture. And so for Oluo, it's inequality that is the sine qua non of cultural appropriation. And indeed, she says, without power imbalance, cultural appropriation is a non-issue. And so I want to focus on those particular cases, and in particular, two harms from cultural appropriation in this context of unequal power relations. First, there's the representational harm, and I think Trevor touched on this already. And here the harm is that the dominant group's control over images of a subordinate group allow that subordinate group's images to be distorted, redefined, and often disparaged. The second harm is that commodification by the dominant group redistributes the material benefits of innovation away from the subordinate group toward the dominant group. And I think it's in the combination of these two harms that we really see resonating in this growing popular consciousness about around cultural appropriation. It's the twin harms of representation and remuneration, or representation and distributive justice, that have found voice, I think, in these current debates around cultural appropriation. But as I think Michael alluded to at the start, in fact, intellectual property, historically at least, has not seemed to be the right tool for addressing some of these problems. And especially the most difficult cases have involved so-called traditional knowledge, or TK. And so TK refers to age-old knowledge handed down from generation to generation. For example, traditional remedies, traditional symbols, designs. And it's often believed that this knowledge has existed for millennia, remarkably unchanged, static over time. So this is the first problem, right? Intellectual property is about new knowledge, and traditional knowledge is cast as old knowledge and static knowledge. We're also told that property authorship can't be determined because the knowledge has passed in the context of Indigenous creations as through oral tradition, and it's not written down or fixed in a tangible medium. We're told that perhaps that the authorship is communal rather than individual. And of course, group claims are vexing. All of this questions around who is a member, who's not a member, who can claim this right, et cetera. And then going further, we're told Indigenous people themselves don't even believe in property rights, right? And I think obviously this one is quite disingenuous when it's used as an argument against claims for property by Indigenous individuals or communities. So as I've written elsewhere, it's this partly because of the difficulty of fitting TK into Western frameworks, right? The square peg, round hole problem. and partly because this knowledge is valued as the opposite of property. Indigenous creation is valued as the commons, and therefore all to take and enjoy. This combination has meant that often the wealth and creative knowledge and capacity for knowledge creation of indigenous peoples is often overlooked. But I want to suggest that, in fact, our understanding of indigenous creation as exclusively TK obscures important ways in which IP can and is already being used to recognize rights in indigenous creators, including rights to contest cultural appropriation directly. So I'm just going to offer two examples. And actually, Paloma, do you mind just putting up the first slide? So the first example deals with one kind of cultural appropriation, and this is what I would call the cultural appropriation that is culturally degrading. Here, the appropriation claims involve a situation where a dominant party's representations misrepresent or caricature a culture. I liked Trevor's concept of abuse there. And, so racist brands from Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's to the Washington national football teams, these logos are examples in this category. Unfortunately, the US Supreme Court has closed the door on statutory restrictions in the federal trademark statute to racially disparaging marks. That said, I think there could be ways in which trademark could be used, not just defensively, but affirmatively as well, to contest cultural appropriation. A case, Navajo Nation versus Urban Outfitters, a 2013 case in the federal district court in New Mexico, involved the Navajo Nation suing Urban Outfitters and Anthropology, Free People, a number of companies for using the Navajo name and images on items without authorization. And a large crux of the contest was also about the complaint here was also about the fact that it was used on things like whiskey flasks and women's underwear in disparaging ways. And in that case, in fact, the court recognized that Navajo Nation has a strong, incontestable trademark in its name to be used only with their authorization on goods. And the court didn't recognize any kind of dilution claim on the part of the Navajo Nation in that case. At the same time, by recognizing that Navajo Nation had a valid trademark, Navajo Nation effectively has reasonable control over the way their brand would be displayed and understood in the marketplace. So that's one example. And then I'll just switch to the other one. In this case, this is a case involving copyright law. And here, I think this case addresses a different kind of a cultural appropriation. That's misappropriation, which I would describe as appropriators absconding with the profits of someone else's intellectual property. And in this case, Neiman Marcus was sued by a native nonprofit, Sealaska Heritage Institute. And Sealaska notably alleged copyright infringement of native artist Clarissa Rizal's work. She had an award-winning work of art that's shown here on the bottom left. And it was turned into this sweater that was sold for $2,500 plus by Neiman Marcus. And here, the argument again is we're not often just talking about communal creations, age-old creations, but we're talking about the contemporary creative works of individual named, celebrated, in fact, authors. And this case, I think notably, the case was brought under, quote, copyright, but also the claim of, quote, cultural appropriation was made in the briefs. So, and the parties ultimately settled. And this general concept is one that we're seeing more and more. Artists pushing back, saying we are also, and artists, indigenous artists around the world, artists of color, saying we are also artists, we are designers, we have names. Our creations aren't something that everyone just has the right to come and take. So I'm gonna, and even people like Vanessa Friedman, the fashion critic for the New York Times, have called out this kind of old culture of blithe thoughtlessness, a creative entitlement that seem to have long justified these kinds of appropriations. I'm going to end by naming a third category. I don't have a slide on this, so we could probably put the slides away. But the third category is racial capitalism. And I'll end by just saying we also need to find a way to contend with the appropriation that occurs when cultural practices become valuable only when they are mediated through white artists. And I think that this is inherent in the example, the Hopi music example that Trevor shared with us, right? So as Jima Ulua puts it, cultural appropriation is the product of a society that prefers its culture cloaked in whiteness. And of course, in property, in the law of real property, we recognize now this is a system that has historically conferred value on whiteness itself, from the recognition of property only in white settlers' hands to housing values premised on racially segregated communities. But I think we need to now more deeply interrogate ways that intellectual property confers value on art based on the race, gender, nationality, ethnicity of the artist. So I'm going to end there and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhavi. Jane, you're up.
Great, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you for the invitation and to be here on a panel with Trevor and Madhavi. It's always a pleasure. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm coming from the lands of Lenape-Hoking, the homelands of the Lenape nations. I want to pay my respects to the ancestors, to the elders, and to the future leaders. And importantly, in making this land acknowledgement, I'm seeking to connect legacies of settler colonialism, also on insisting on acts that are necessary for changing practices, for thinking about how we actually support Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous futurity moving forward. So the project that I want to talk a little bit about is a little bit different. It's kind of this kind of question about what do you do? How do you deal with some of these questions? As Madhavi said, sometimes intellectual property can function as a strategic tool to support Indigenous interests, but there are many instances where intellectual property does not function in that way and has not functioned in that way. And that was kind of also speaking to what Trevor was talking about in relationship to Laura Bolton becoming the copyright holder over Hopi songs. So if I can have the slides, Paloma, I'll just kind of go through. I want to talk just a little bit about this project around the traditional knowledge labels, and you can go to the second slide there, which is kind of really positioning a different kind of alternative to that sits outside of intellectual property law, that brings Indigenous cultural authority back into records, archives, libraries, museums, universities that have historically functioned to erase Indigenous names, as well as the protocols for how certain kinds of materials should be used into the future. So if we can go to the next slide. So about 10 years ago, started developing, out of frustration in relationship to what do you do? How do you find different kinds of mechanisms that can do some of the work if the law itself fails or the law itself is failing to support particular communities? And so we developed these labels, which are non-legal educative digital tags that Indigenous communities customize to bring their names back into the records, and with their names bringing cultural authority and different kinds of understandings of how certain kinds of materials should be used into the future. So we have 20 traditional knowledge labels that we've developed. They are human readable and digitally and machine readable, so that they get into the digital infrastructures where the kind of records that that hold these materials are also embedded. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of 3 of the labels that we developed: the attribution label, the culturally sensitive label, and the seasonal label. And what's interesting about all of these 3 is that they speak to very specific needs that communities have to be heard and to be recognized as having particular protocols around how certain kinds of materials should be used and when it should be used. We have the attribution label, which is used almost by every single community because names matter, as Madhavi said. Names matter. Names were erased and names matter to bring them back into these spaces. The culturally sensitive label is one that recognizes that there can be sensitivities around certain kinds of material that can be based on derogatory histories of using people's names in the wrong way, or different kinds of ways of not really accounting for not having access. So for example, communities haven't had access to their language materials. They might sit in institutions that are hundreds of miles from their communities. And so there's kind of different sensitivities that exist in relationship to getting access to those kinds of material and what kinds of use can be made. The seasonal label is a label that connects land and land-based teachings to knowledge. This is something that law can't do. It doesn't connect real property law to intellectual property law. Yet within Indigenous worldviews, those two things are deeply related. And so an example of that is that, for instance, certain kinds of songs should only be sung at certain times of the year. So for instance, harvesting sweetgrass songs are only sung at the time when the sweetgrass is being harvested. And so this label again starts to speak to that specificity in relationship to care and looking after Indigenous cultural material. Next slide, please. This is an example of how the labels work in practice. This is a label that has been applied by the Scowlitz community, which is a band of the Stolo First Nation in British Columbia. And you can see that the icon itself remains stable. This is how we've kind of created this system so it can be utilized internationally across multiple jurisdictions. But the text itself is customized by each Indigenous community, which allows for that sovereignty and that specificity to kind of be spoken into the records. Can I have the next slide? So what the traditional knowledge labels really communicate are three things. Provenance, where does knowledge come from? What are the right responsibilities that sit around that knowledge when it comes from a particular place that has cultural authority that's embedded within it? The second thing is cultural protocols. What are those cultural protocols for sharing that knowledge responsibly, respectfully, and ethically? And third, permissions. What are the kinds of permissions that need to be in place? What are the consent processes that have gone into making decisions around how certain kinds of material can be used and shared into the future? Next slide, please, Paloma. So I just want to give you another example of how these labels have been utilized within the Library of Congress. This is really about thinking how records can change and some of the mistakes that are embedded within archives, libraries, museums, and universities that hold Indigenous collections, not only in the United States, but around the world. So next slide. So this is a record in the Library of Congress for the first sound recordings that were made on Indigenous lands in Maine in 1890. This is the record that the Library of Congress had for these recordings, and you can see it's a really impoverished record. There's not much information there about the content at all, except for the information that is there is around the cylinder, around the technology. If I can have the next slide, please, Paloma. And so working with the Passamaquoddy community, this information around this record has been radically updated. Pages of information have now been added to this record, partly because the Passamaquoddy community have been able to add their cultural authority into this record. They've been able to add their names more clearly, as well as their aspirations for how this material should be used into the future, including that they don't want it to be used in commercial ways, and they do want it to be used for education in educational contexts. Next slide, Paloma, please. What's important about this example is the question for the Library of Congress came up about where do we place the traditional knowledge labels within the rights advisory? Are they rights? Do they sit there as rights? In the original record, there was one rights field that included that Harvard University held the rights to those sound recordings, not the Passamaquoddy community. In this updated rights advisory, the traditional knowledge labels are being utilized to indicate that these are first rights. These continue to be cultural rights and they need to be recognized within the systems as well. Next slide, please, Paloma. And what this has kind of meant at a larger level is that for the Library of Congress to utilize the traditional knowledge labels, they've actually had to change their entire digital infrastructure to include them. So the work that the Passamaquoddy community has done to add labels to their to their 31 wax cylinder records now means that every Indigenous community that has items within the Library of Congress can add their own traditional knowledge labels into the Library of Congress's digital infrastructure. This is just the JSON file for the Library of Congress, where they've had to add a new field for traditional knowledge labels. In a way, this is what this speaks to, is that digital infrastructures themselves are not neutral. They carry with them the bias of all the kind of societal components around them. So for instance, the exclusion of Indigenous names and Indigenous authority. Next slide, Paloma. So the labels are also used in other really interesting contexts. These are the labels being utilized on syllabi within university curriculum to kind of indicate that collaboration and partnership have been part of deciding on what kinds of curriculum are being produced that are presenting Indigenous worldviews. This is an example from the University of Tasmania. Next slide. This is a use of the labels within a Lao context. The Oma use particular designs in similar ways to how their designs have been appropriated in multiple fashion contexts. They set up a database of all of their designs and utilize the traditional knowledge labels as part of marking their interests and their authority that they retain over their designs. And again, this is kind of a defensive intellectual property approach in terms of publishing their designs, but they utilize the labels as part of that strategy. Next slide, please, Paloma. And just finally, it's important to note that the labels themselves are customizable only by Indigenous communities. But in this process, we kind of recognize that institutions and researchers also have work to do, and they have work that is their responsibility to recognize and disclose Indigenous rights and interests. So many of these mistakes that we've been dealing with as historical legacies within archives, libraries, and museums continue unless we actually also change research practice at its core. And that means identifying Indigenous rights and interests from the beginning of research practices. So next slide, please. We have 4 notices that we've developed: the biocultural notice, the traditional knowledge notice, attribution incomplete, and the open to collaborate. And these really do a lot of work in terms of getting to that first stage of saying there are Indigenous rights here. We need to start partnering and collaborating with Indigenous communities in order to put those right cultural authority back into these spaces and to make sure that Indigenous people are engaged as legitimate authorities over their knowledge into the future. Next slide. This is just one example of that, of the notices being utilised in the disclosure of historical collections. This is in Simon Fraser University with their most frequented image archive, which is of Northwest Coast images. And they've put that open to collaborate notice as part of a marking that they're starting to do that critical work of engaging with Indigenous communities to get the proper names back into that photographic archive so that people know directly who to contact and who to engage with when they want to use those photographs into the future. Next slide. And I think that's the end. Sorry, that was like, that was very fast, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to share this work with you all.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks to all of your models of concision here. So I'm going to fire off a question. I guess it would go first to Trevor, but I'm sure the rest of you have some ideas on it. I mean, you alluded to the sovereignty principle, which I support, but as you know, I've expressed in print some skepticism about the relevance of it for managing intangible cultural heritage. For example, the United States is a sovereign. I think we agree with that, and yet we have a hard time keeping our cultural property or our intellectual property under our control, and that's partly because of new digital technologies and so on. And that problem, I'd say that's a problem times 10 for Indigenous people. So, and then related to that, the fact is there are something like 570 federally recognized Indigenous nations in the United States, and I'm not even talking about First Nations in Canada. How can we manage 570 different sets of rules about how to manage certain kinds of cultural information? So I guess I wonder how you'd respond to that, Trevor, and perhaps Madhavi and Jane want to jump in as well.
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you very much, Madhavi, for the wonderful presentations. It was fantastic to learn from you both. I just to, I guess, jump in and talk about the sovereignty piece of this. More and more tribes are developing and adopting their own intellectual property frameworks and codes and codifying them. Many Indigenous communities, at least all of the ones I've ever worked with, already have their own what we would call intellectual property or traditional knowledge ownership or management structures, right? They have certain duties and obligations to certain kinds of people. They have actual exclusive rights, which perhaps mirror more of what our intellectual property looks like. So the question is, how do we then implement that? How do we find ways to respect that? And I think certainly Jane's work, it goes a long way in making that happen. And I think the challenges are there, like Madhavi was saying, it really is difficult to reconcile these with intellectual property law in many ways. So, you know, certainly one of the big challenges that many Indigenous tribes have in the United States is trying to get federal enforcement of Indigenous laws that they create. The Montana Doctrine that we've had to live with since the early 1980s often prevents the enforcement of Indigenous laws on settler populations, even within tribal reservations. However, we have had some interesting developments along that front. You know, there certainly have been cases where Indigenous cultural property laws have been enforced against non-members of tribes, and we have to see, I guess, in the future, whether that will continue to develop and expand. Indigenous sovereignty continues to be recognized. Certainly the McGirt decision that was handed down just a couple of years ago shows that Indigenous sovereignty certainly is alive and well, and the United States courts, at least, are willing to recognize that it exists. So I think just to answer kind of on a larger scale of this question, yeah, I do think we need to have more enforcement of Indigenous intellectual property structures, intellectual property rights, certainly through the American system, the Euro-American system, but also through Indigenous IP codes that are out there. I think those need to be respected and enforced. And of course, informally through, I think, institutional policies. We saw, you know, the American Research Libraries Association. We saw the Society for American Archivists adopt the protocols for Native American materials that the Society for American Archivists have established. And I think that set of protocols really does require respect for Indigenous intellectual property laws and regulations. So I think that's one piece. The other is we should perhaps consider utilizing more contractual mechanisms. You know, if you really want to do work with an Indigenous community, utilizing their culture, why not bind yourself to the Indigenous community's intellectual property laws? That makes total sense to me, right? Why not sign an agreement that says that you will abide by those? And not only that, you obligate yourself to bind those that come into contact with the products of your research or endeavor down the line. We certainly see that in Creative Commons licensing and open source licensing. I think for those of us that work with Indigenous communities, it's important for us to also make use of those if we can, to be able to expand the reach of Indigenous sovereignty. Anyway, I've spoken way too long on this, but anyway, hand it over to anyone else that wants to chime in.
That's helpful. Jane or Madhavi, do you want to jump in on that issue?
I'll just jump in just to also say thank you first to Jane and Trevor for your presentations and just connecting where Trevor was leaving us. I think, Jane, your idea about this open to collaborate label and how that can facilitate these interactions. But again, just going back to Michael's sovereignty question, right? We don't have jurisdictions that are hermetically sealed. And that's where I think like what's exciting about these like popular claims around cultural appropriation is they force people to collaborate. They're forcing, perhaps increasingly forcing and some interaction between Indigenous IP and Western IP. So maybe formally under Western IP, you don't have to collaborate. You don't have to ask permission or pay a royalty, but the social pressure of kind of the, you know, where these two regimes meet could push us there. And then if you're these ideas of formalizing Indigenous IP concepts through labels that are then digitized and that again also shows that how easily, or these two jurisdictions may become intertwined in that sense, in terms of the new codes, the extra legal codes that begin to govern outside of the formal laws. So very fascinating.
If I might say, SAR, I mean, one of the reasons I love working here is that these issues are not just theoretical. I mean, we've pioneered partnerships with communities that, and I won't toot our horn too much longer, but we have a large collection of Southwestern pottery, and we seek the permission of each pueblo to bring their sort of selected authorities to SAR to review the collection. Everything that they say is recorded and translated if necessary. And then it's returned to the community for their review. And if they want to sequester information that they find sensitive or secret, they're allowed to remove it from the record and keep whatever they like. And then it's returned to us for our accession data. And that as you can imagine, it's a laborious process. So it began with reviewing, I think, 1,300 artifacts by two assigned experts from Zuni Pueblo. And it took 5 years, I think, for that to be completely completed. But when we're done, we will have the most detailed information about, especially pottery, but also stone carvings and other items of culture. And if the items are deemed to be sensitive, culturally sensitive, in some cases they're repatriated, or in any case are not made available to the general public for view. And the pots are sort of tucked into the far corner of the racks where they can't be seen by people. And this sort of cycles back to Trevor's notion that collaboration means if it doesn't involve an actual contract, it's an implicit contract that here are our rules that we've agreed upon, and this is how we'll handle this information, and we're subject to your authority to tell us what we cannot know or what we can know and what we can do with what we learn and that sort of thing. And I think this is what NAGPRA and repatriation law has done to museums. They have to establish these much more egalitarian and balanced relationships with source communities. It's not the disaster, the end of the museum that people were predicting, 25 years ago, but in fact something a whole lot more interesting and important. Let me throw out this is more legal geekery, I think, and I hope you forgive me, but years ago I had a couple of very friendly debates with Carol Rose, who's an authority on property law at Yale, and we actually went on the road a couple of times and sort of argued back and forth in front of an audience. But Carol really believes that property is empowering, and she makes a really powerful case for it. Anthropologists seek property as a cultural specific kind of concept, that it doesn't apply well in some contexts, and in other situations it does. So what do you think about that? In some cases, you've all alluded to the utility of intellectual property law in specific situations. In other cases, it's complete inappropriateness for dealing with the kind of cultural sensitivities that you're talking about. So does somebody want to make the case for property in a Carol Rose fashion, or are you convinced that it's just not the best way to approach this question? Somebody going to rise to the bait here?
I will. Why not? I don't think it's an either or in that kind of way. I think that property can be deployed strategically by Indigenous communities when it meets certain kinds of ends, but property isn't a panacea either. It's not going to, it comes with limitations, and because it creates certain kinds of relationships that are dependent upon a framework of property. And that framework of property, even where our idea of property comes from, is already culturally specific. And so within contexts where there are different worldviews around how you care and how you steward and how you look after and how you think about futures, property is incredibly limited for what people want to do and how they want to share information. I find it much more useful to start thinking about, because property then starts to move into these languages of ownership, of exclusive possession. These are not languages that necessarily are easily utilized within Indigenous contexts, particularly around how certain kinds of information is shared and by whom and within what ways and with what kind of nuance within Indigenous community contexts. So just to kind of say that property can be deployed really strategically, and in other ways it completely limits the kind of conversation that you can even have.
Hmm.
So I think I'm more like Carol Rose in the sense I'm also a property scholar, professor, teacher, and we understand property as necessary as a legal mechanism for regulating competing rights to and interests in shared resources. Right. So so in fact, in the law schools, the first thing we teach is that property is not about exclusion, absolute exclusion or exclusive rights or ownership. It's about what rights do various individuals have vis-a-vis the same resource. It's relational. And so in that sense, I actually ultimately am optimistic about it. One is because it's an important tool to have understanding of and power over, but it's a tool that should evolve as community values and social relations evolve. So and I think that it's absolutely infused with values around what does it mean to live in a democratic society? What does it mean to live in a free and equal society? So I am optimistic about it as a governance mechanism and a tool.
Trevor, any comments on that? Or you're nodding your head.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I take a bit of a middle ground on this, where certainly I think kind of our Western notions of property that we live under within the kind of the United States system are very flexible when it comes down to it. I've taught property now for 3 years, and it makes sense that those could be molded in many different ways. I think one of the things that a lot of our discourse on property doesn't have are what Jane was talking about, kind of obligations toward one's property. A lot of times we think about property as kind of, certainly we can manage it. We have the right to possess and use and exclude if we want to. And there's lots of different arrangements in terms of our relationships. But internally, we tend to have a lot of freedom, except for perhaps some limitations on the ways that we exclude other people, or perhaps zoning regulations and things like that with real property. But we don't often talk about responsibilities, duties, obligations, requirements when it comes to how we utilize this property in relation to other people, or perhaps internally, just the configurations of the land and things like that. I think with intellectual property in particular, for the Indigenous communities I work in, one has a lot of duty and obligation. There are certain standards of care, and those are a little bit harder to think about, I suppose, just in a property context. But many people have made the argument, Kristen Carpenter and Angela Riley among many, that a stewardship model of property could very well work if we think of it in those terms. So I don't know. I don't think the property boat is sunk. I think there are potential, and certainly Indigenous people that are out there putting their work and creativity into the public often have to rely on a common package of rights to be able to get that out into the world so that other people can circulate it and use it. Hmm. Yeah, I think there certainly has to be a balance, and that's one of the challenges that we all have to deal with.
So it sort of evokes that classic question: if I own a Picasso, do I have a right to just burn it? Or does the culture at large have some kind of heritage claim or some kind of cultural claim on this, an object that I should be stewarding responsibly? It's an interesting set of questions. We've got a lot of questions coming in. I'm not surprised. I'll move through these as fast as I can. So Barbara Chatterjee asks, as a person who's been engaged with several different cultures in my life, I've often observed that external interest has often forced the owners of cultural property to keep producing items to share or sell in the traditional mode and reject the notion that members of these cultures moved into new mediums of production. That's troubled her. So I guess the question is, do these cultural heritage traditions limit creativity? I think I know how you're going to answer that, but does somebody want to take that?
I think that's the first danger of propertization and commodifying culture, right? That we're going to create these reified communities that are static and don't really reflect the lived dynamic reality of life, but also of art. And so in that sense, thinking about how do we incentivize change and innovation and dissent. These are all incredibly important in the indigenous context as well as outside of it. So, and at the same time, I would contend that even intellectual property and property laws have built into them systems to promote that they're not about absolute rights that are fixed, but are about fostering modification, transformation, and change over time. But I agree with Barbara here that this is a problem when we're selling culture and selling tradition in these static, reified ways.
There's a question from Dennis Alberg. We've got a fellow Australian here, Jane. He's an economist. He says, Madhavi's definition based on power imbalance suggests that it would be acceptable for Clarissa Rizal, I don't know who that is, but to appropriate a George O'Keeffe design, but not the reverse, assuming that George O'Keeffe were still with us. Am I interpreting her correctly? That is, if the weak are stealing from the strong, that's okay, but the reverse is cultural appropriation. What do you think about that?
Now, briefly, I appreciate the question because I realize I need to clarify what I mean by this. I think what I'm trying to say is the kinds of cultural appropriation claims that I think get the mass appeal are the ones that involve a rich company like Epic Games, which owns Fortnite, or a multinational fashion company, when they are profiting off of often exact copying from artists of color who are often overlooked. So I don't at all mean to say that it's okay in all instances when the weak take from the rich or or from the strong. But I think that I do have faith in concepts like fair use in copyright law, for example, that promote transformation and critical use of works. And I think those can often empower people from more disenfranchised communities to appropriate dominant works and all of that. But I don't mean to at all present this as it's always okay if the ratchet goes that way, but more to help to understand why there is an appeal, and I think a valid appeal to the claims decrying cultural appropriation when dominant companies and corporations are profiting off the backs of creators of color.
I have a related question I wanted to pose to Trevor, and that is, it used to be the case, and I'm not sure right now, that the music of choice for young Hopis was reggae. And there was a famous festival every year called Reggae on the Res and so on. So is that cultural appropriation? Is it okay cultural appropriation? I presume that the Hopi people and Jamaican musicians might see eye to eye and enjoy the exchange. How would you deal with a situation like that?
Well, and I maybe just to continue to develop the hypo here. So I actually have been working quite a bit with Hopi performances of other tribes material. And so part of the work that I do in repatriation is to not only bring cultural materials back to a community, but then to ask, wait, so where did this actually come from? If we keep tracing it all the way back, how far do we go? What's been interesting to think about with people out home is that a lot of people feel like that it's perfectly fine to continue to follow the chain back and to acknowledge that, oh yeah, this particular Hopi song is actually from Zuni. Why don't we go back there and ask them how it is that we should use this song going forward? And then get to Zuni and continue to ask the question, right? I think Indigenous peoples, and I don't want to generalize, but many of the Indigenous communities I've worked in, this notion of lineage is very valuable and a way that we connect ourselves to other people. It's a way of decommodifying, perhaps, to reconnect and kind of make clear the lines that have been erased through appropriation. and through various types of technology that tend to disembody culture and move it along in ways that we can't have a lineage. But I guess in terms of the reggae question, I think lots of people have different ways of appreciating and connecting with reggae. But it's been interesting as I've talked with folks from Hopi reggae bands back in a few years ago when I was talking with a lot of them have actually been back to the Caribbean or have talked with folks that have been in the scene. Other people haven't, and it's interesting to see people's individual relationships with these communities and ways of wanting to have some sort of reciprocity, some sort of connective tissue that connects those types of appropriations. I don't think they're bad. I think just a matter of a work in progress, building up those alliances and understanding the protocols that other communities might have with those, and then developing the relationships so that we know we're using things in a way that's non-harmful.
Sure, that makes total sense. There's an interesting question here from Emmett. He says, I work in the area of petroglyphs to bring their beauty and mystery from a canyon wall to my wall. Etchings like the spiral is seen in multiple cultures across the world, etc. Many of these etchings have been assimilated into contemporary Native American cultures and so into all kinds of popular culture, especially here in Santa Fe. So who owns these, and from whom would I have to get permission for my art? Anyone want to tackle that? I see that the mutings are still, everybody's muted. It's a tough one.
I mean, I don't think traditional intellectual property would cover this, but I think that the kind of things that Jane's working on helps to promote understanding about the provenance, as everybody's been talking about, just enhancing our understandings of provenance, of context, of history, and here, put more in the context of respect for that history as opposed to rights and permissions.
And I would just follow up on that. I mean, I would guess that these are really similar kinds of questions that have come about in Australia in relationship to rock art and the taking of particular kinds of images and designs that are 40,000 years old, 80,000 years old in Australia, and then kind of putting them on tea towels and using them in different kinds of ways. And what's been really clear within an Australian context is these things do come from somewhere, and they do have relationships to present day communities, and it's kind of doing the work of engaging and having those conversations. And I guess I would connect that back to what Trevor was saying about, there are these questions about provenance. They're never going to be neat and easy. They're going to take work and time and engagement and collaboration and conversations. But it's also about reciprocity and relationships and protocols and thinking about the different kinds of permissions that you might have as an artist that you actually want to engage with. When you're kind of reproducing those images, what story do you want to tell about where those images have come from? And is it a story that is one that says it was open for everybody to use and so I've done that, or is it a story that's I've collaborated with these communities because these designs come from their lands and their territories and they have a present day relationship to that lineage, to that history, to those designs, to those images? They're different kinds of stories and they're different kinds of relationships that are required to tell them. And, your choice will be whatever it is. But I think what we're saying is that there is kind of an impetus to do that harder work, to go in that space and kind of say, well, what does this really mean? And is it really about ownership, or is it about relationships and fostering those relationships? Because the outcomes might be really, really different.
Russ asked the question, he says, I occasionally come across Zuni jewelry that's obviously counterfeit, will be visibly below the level of work of a particular artist. They allege that counterfeits were coming from overseas, currently China. What can be done about it? Well, there's a straightforward legal question that I'm sure that you all can answer.
Trevor, you want to jump in, or?
Sure, I can start us off. I mean, one of the important things to mind is that we have some specific legislation that's meant to protect Indigenous creators from false marketing efforts. So, for example, you have the Indian Arts and Crafts Act that prohibits people claiming that something is Indian made, Indian being a term of art. And so, there may be arguments, and this was a case, the Clarissa Rizal case, where one of the claims that was being made was that this was, in fact, by saying that something was a raven's tail coat, by Neiman Marcus making that claim, they were in fact violating the act by taking a traditional form that was well known to occur within that particular community in Alaska, and then saying that they were doing it and somehow claiming there was a indigenous creation of this, or maybe it was endorsed by the tribe. And so I think, we do have laws like the Indian Arts and Crafts Act that potentially intervene in this kind of a way. If you're using a particular mark or a particular design that is well known to be Zuni, and you're creating a likelihood of confusion or perhaps an implication that it's Indian made, there could be a potential right of action to keep that out of the United States under our current legal frameworks. Now, of course, there could be many other approaches to this too. So I'll go ahead and pass the baton to somebody else to talk about those. But I would say Indian Arts and Crafts Act might be one of the powerful ones.
Yeah, absolutely. And trademark is another area as well, right? So just as the Navajo Nation owns incontestable trademark in their name in association with goods like jewelry and arts and crafts and clothing, we can have, you could potentially see trademark being an important tool to prohibit counterfeits here as well.
I've got a related trademark question. So I assume there are these legacy trademarks that, like Mohawk carpets and Jeep Cherokee and Apache helicopters, that are no longer subject, because under my understanding is that under current policy, you certainly can't use a native tribal name without the permission of the community itself. Is that correct? But I have no idea whether the Cherokee approved their name being identified with a Jeep, or the Mohawks had anything to do with carpet making. Are they just considered sort of grandfathered in under previous policies? That's probably a Madhavi question, since you're the trademark.
Yeah, I am, but I do trademark law, but I actually don't know about the specific regulations with respect to these names. But I don't know, Jane was shaking her head. I don't know if you have a little bit more familiarity with.
Yeah, so tribal names aren't protected unless they have a registered trademark for their name, which is what with the Navajo Nation they actually did have, which was what enabled them to win that case. Most tribal names aren't registered as trademarks, and therefore they are open to be used in all these kinds of ways that, there aren't permissions around Cherokee Jeep or Apache software or Stolo strawberries. In fact, it's names really matter, and names aren't just any names. Indigenous community names have long histories. They have deep significance. To take an Indigenous name and apply it to your product is kind of disrespectful. So one thing that the USPTO does have a database around is tribal insignias. That's as far as the USPTO has gone in terms of protecting Indigenous tribal images in that kind of in the insignia way. But for tribal names, unless they've already been trademarked, they can be utilized by anybody in any other context.
But isn't it true if the use is disrespectful, if it's associated with a project that's demeans the tribe, then it would probably be rejected? Isn't that so?
I think that then, well, not necessarily, no. You go, Madhavi.
So that provision of the Federal Trademark Act was actually overthrown by the U.S. Supreme Court in the last few years as violating the First Amendment, right? So in fact, it's our First Amendment right to demean others. So, and we can't have a federal statute that would prohibit that. So that part of the law is no longer considered constitutional.
Well, let's hear it for the Supremes. That's too bad, but it is what it is. Well, look, just to sort of wrap here, what I'm hearing, and correct me if you feel that I'm wrong, is that on the one hand, there's a use for strict laws like the Native American Arts and Craft Act, and certainly protecting the rights of individual Native American artists to their work and so on. But that a lot of the issues really have to do with mutual respect, dignity, and establishing equitable relationships, really, in which, within a context of sharing information. Does that seem about right? I think the problem, of course, is that it takes a lot of time to do that. It's not something that can happen in a second, whereas the law, at least in some cases, is very clear. You can do this, you can't do that. That's, I suppose, why property law is attractive in some contexts, or useful in some contexts, whereas the idea of, can I even know this? Am I allowed to even see this? Is something that has to be negotiated. Can I sing this song in another context? Is something that takes years of building rapport and mutual trust and understanding the sensitivities involved. Not bad things, but a demanding kind of discipline, I think, which is hard to reconcile in some cases with the American desire for a quick solution to everything. Well, we've really come to the top of the hour. In fact, I know, Jane, you have a hard stop in a couple of minutes, so I will bring this conversation to a close. But let me just say, Madhavi Sunder, Trevor Reed, Jane Anderson, it's a pleasure to talk to you, and I feel like all of us learned a lot from your contribution. Again, thanks to the three of you, and I look forward to seeing you at SAR someday.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you. So great to see everyone and to do this. Thank you.